Does the government know more about UFOs than they're letting on?
100%. Whoever thinks that there aren't aliens around, you are such a small-minded person to think that we can be the only living, breathing things out there.
To anyone who doesn't think that aliens are around, have you been to the DMV? Hello, hello. Welcome to another edition of Bridging the Gap with Brian and Maddie. I, a 49-year-old male, Maddie, a 26-year-old female. There is a generational gap. There is a gender gap going on. Every single week we pick a topic and we see what our outlooks are as it relates to that. And this week we are going with conspiracy theories. Now, why are we bringing this up specifically? The whole thing with Jeffrey Epstein and the alleged suicide that occurred in prison last week. And one of the first things I heard once this happened, this very tragic event, was, hey, this probably wasn't a suicide. There were people in power who had a lot to lose, and they may have been behind his murder. Now, when it comes to rumblings like this, Maddie, at your age and your gender, is this something that you, I would say, reflexively buy into or say, oh, that's hogwash?
I feel like our generation, meaning my generation, is very quick to combat anything that is given to us. So with this whole Jeffrey Epstein thing, you want to believe what you're given in the media, but how often do you see an article on Facebook and then somebody has to comment, well, I think it's this, and then another person says, no, well, I think it's this. People now don't take it for what it is. They take what they see and then they're like, okay, well, how can I fit my opinion into this?
Well, let me ask this question then. When you're discussing your ingestion of news, is it something that you're primarily getting off of social media or via news outlets, and does that shade how you feel about things?
Social media for sure. I mean, I can't remember the last time I went to any type of real news outlet. I'll be perfectly honest with you. I get most of my political news from Instagram and Facebook, which right then and there, you already know. If you have a brain, you need to realize that you need to do some research if you're going to comment on this.
Well, I think we can chat about that a little bit more in the coming minutes here, but I'm going to stick with this Jeffrey Epstein thing and say, from the perspective of Generation X, I tend to think that when we get news, our reflex is to believe it, but that totally has to do with our upbringing as opposed to yours, because I grew up in the era of, when I was very young, 3 networks. And it was Walter Cronkite when I was very young.
Did you even have a remote control yet?
We didn't. I was the remote control.
Oh, God.
My dad saying, Brian, get up off of your fat butt and go change the channel or fix the rabbit ears for the love of God. And Walter Cronkite, people like that, and even a little bit later, like Tom Brokaw, you trusted these people implicitly. And I think part of the reason was, first of all, you weren't as exposed to as much information. But not only that, there wasn't this rush to get news out there as quickly as possible. And therefore, things were better vetted. People knew that their career lives were at risk and on the line. And Dan Rather's career essentially ended because he got something wrong, which just sounds so crazy in this day and age. And if he were a media person nowadays, I don't think that would have been an issue. So our knee jerk is to say, well, when we get news, it probably is accurate and it probably is true. But I will also say this, in this day and age, I ingest news differently than you do. I do not trust anything that I see on Facebook, social media, and I think the 2016 election is reason enough not to. How many times did you hear that inaccurate things were being put up on social media? There was all kinds of hacking going on and things of that nature. But that having been said, maybe I'm starting to come around, because when it came to this particular story with Jeffrey Epstein, I have to admit, I've got a lot of skepticism. And by the way, I'm reading stories on the hard news outlets. I'm looking at what the autopsy has to say. I realize that there are people in power who have so much to lose. And I'm wondering, could this have been an inside job?
I hear you. I mean, the facts are just not lining up very well. I mean, you see that first article He commits suicide. Okay. This sounds awful. I'm hoping it's true based on the fact that, okay, maybe he is just riddled with guilt of all of the things that he did and he just can't handle it anymore. And so he's like, I got to get out of here.
Well, you don't want to believe that somebody this powerful could maybe pull something off like this and get away with it. Right. And I think that's where you're coming from.
Right. He got caught and now he can't live with himself.
But let's back up a little bit and let's move away from this story in particular. And let's ask this question, because another thing that I tend to do a lot when I'm on streaming services, I'm big into documentaries, and I will watch a lot of them that question things that I never would have questioned maybe otherwise. Like, for example, 9/11. Was the government behind that, or did it happen specifically the way that we were told? How old were you when 9/11 occurred?
I was
2001. 7 years old.
2001. 6 or 7, yeah.
Okay. And that must have been a lot for you to process at that very young age.
It was a lot. And, you know, it was a young age, but I still remember exactly where I was. I remember getting let out of school early and not really knowing why, getting home to the apartment that my mother and I were living in. I mean, it was clearly a devastating event. I have this many details of that day, you know. The news is on and they're playing that horrendous video that they had. Your heart was just breaking. And as a 7-year-old, I'm watching this. Why wouldn't I believe it?
At that young age, I don't think you were in any position to question any of that.
Right.
But as time has marched on, and I'm wondering, have you watched any of those documentaries? Have you read anything which has put forth alleged evidence that maybe this didn't go down in the way that you were told? And would you say that you tend to believe it happened in the way that we were told, or maybe there was something more nefarious behind it?
I have watched a couple documentaries on it. A lot of them haven't really been about, are they telling the truth? This is the real truth, that sort of thing.
Now,
really
is this
haven't.
the kind of thing because you don't want to believe that perhaps there was something behind it that wasn't presented in the way?
I think it's fair to say that, but on the other hand, I also just feel like skeptical people will always be skeptical, whether it's the truth or it's not the truth. And skeptical people, I have many in my life that enjoy the controversy of not agreeing with the mass population. And I feel like there's a lot of times with conspiracy theories, they can branch off in many different ways because maybe there's a lack of information. Maybe there is an open-ended part of the incident that's happening. Now, for 9/11, I was pretty young. So the facts that I do have, I was only watching the news and what they were saying to me.
I will say, as somebody who was much older when that occurred, as a matter of fact, at that time, I was 31 years old. I totally believed what I was being told. Even to this day, in spite of what I'm saying about Jeffrey Epstein, I still believe that this was something that Osama bin Laden was behind, that it was Al-Qaeda. I have watched some of those documentaries in which they are trying to show you other examples in which that wasn't the case. But I don't know. I'm just not buying it. And I'm wondering if that's a byproduct of my upbringing. Or, look, I did a lot of research on it, too, and I feel pretty comfortable saying that for every single wacko conspiracy theory that you can throw at me, there's a lot of evidence that sort of flies in the face of that. I think maybe the most interesting example, to go back a little bit further for the two of us, because I can actually find something that happened before either one of us were born that we've both heard a lot about in terms of skepticism. And that is, and this is the 50th anniversary of it having occurred, the moon landing.
Oh, yes.
How many of your friends believe Stanley Kubrick directed it? It was in a Hollywood studio. No one has ever been on the moon. No one's been on there since, so the whole thing had to be phony. What is your take on that whole thing?
I think it's absolutely ridiculous. I think people just want to disagree with media, I swear. And especially with that one, I mean, that's way before internet and social media and all that stuff. So I found it interesting that people were questioning it. I think it was just so revolutionary at the time that people's brains were exploding.
They couldn't wrap their heads around
it. They were like,
so how could it be possible?
There is no way we are on another planet right now.
And it was the kind of thing, too, where Russia was ahead of us in the space race, and there was this scramble because of the way the Cold War was building. Hey, we've got to be ahead of them. So I think there were some people who thought, wouldn't it be in our best interest to fake it, to sort of squelch those flames and maybe look like we're ahead of them when we really aren't. But one thing that I did do as the 50th anniversary was approaching, and I don't know if you got to see the CNN documentary that was released recently where they had all kinds of archival footage. They cleaned it all up and they put together this fabulous documentary. I would highly recommend it. So I started looking up, there's a lot of satellites and things of that nature that pass by the moon and take photographs. And Japan at one point sent something by to take some photos. And in those photos, you could see some of the things that were left behind by the Americans back at that time. And I'm sure a conspiracy theorist would say, well, those photos have been faked as well.
Right.
But you know what? That's enough evidence for me. I don't think like every country in the world is going to be in on this thing and try to support it. We can go back even further. And I will tell you this one I hold some skepticism about, and I've done a lot of research about this, and I don't know how much you care because of how young you are. But the JFK assassination, what do you think about that one? Do you think it was just Lee Harvey Oswald, or with everything else that was going on at the time, with Vietnam in the offing and with some things that you've heard about the mafia and his relationship with Marilyn Monroe, Cuba, there are so many things in play here where there were a lot of people who probably didn't want him alive.
Remind me, Reader's Digest version of the media story, why they thought it happened.
The media presented that it was a lone gunman in the form of Lee Harvey Oswald, but then there was the Warren Commission, and then there was everything that I just said to you, where there were a lot of people who didn't necessarily want him in a position of power in terms of where he was taking the country and thought that he needed to be taken out. And while the Warren Commission did present a report that said, no, it was just the lone gunman.
It was just a crazy dude that went off.
And even though there were witnesses who said they thought they saw another shooter on the grassy knoll and all of those other things.
See,
and if you look at the trajectory of the bullets and the way that his head went this way and that thing and everything else,
that's when conspiracy theories go nuts, is when people start chiming in. It's like, I saw this. No, I saw this. But honestly, I think nobody in a sane state of being is just going to go off for no reason. I think there was reasoning behind his assassination. He was a man of power. There was a lot of stuff going on during his presidency. There's no reason for somebody waking up and like eating their Cheerios and going, you know what? I feel like killing the president today.
All right, so we both have some skepticism on that one. Let me ask you this one. Does the government know more about UFOs than they're letting
100%. 100%.
I am totally with you on that one, too.
I am a full believer that we are not the only specimens out there. Whoever thinks that there aren't aliens around, you are such a small-minded person to think that we can be the only living, breathing things out there.
To anyone who doesn't think that aliens are around, have you been to the DMV? And I'm not just talking about the people in line, some of the people that work there as well. And no offense if you do, by the way. All right. We don't like to get overly political here, but there's no way that we can bring this topic up without addressing the 2016 election. And when it comes to how everybody feels about what went down, whether or not you're a fan of the president, either way, there was this whole thing about the potential meddling by the Russians, the stuff that we talked about when it came to social media. Are you more prone to believe that the fix was in when it came to that election? Or do you think, look, it's sour grapes from a bunch of people who wanted it to go the other way and just can't accept the fact that it did go the way that it did?
I have one foot in one area and one foot in the other. The one thing that this election taught me was to pay attention. And I think that my generation has a hard time understanding government. It is a confusing thing. And growing up in a generation where we are so heavily involved in social media, that is personally where I get a lot of my political news, my political views, all of the things that I see on my Facebook. And I'm seeing all of these accusations and I'm seeing all of these, awful comments. It made me realize, like, okay, I think I need to be paying more attention to this.
If we were a little bit closer, and you're going to hate to hear this, I would give you a big hug, because I would say this is my biggest frustration with your generation when it comes to the ingestion of news. As somebody who, by the way, I've been a media personality for 26 years, I have had to pay attention. I grew up in a day and age when that kind of research and due diligence mattered. And I could see, if I was born at another time, how it would be so easy to get sucked in to all of that in that world. And having a 19-year-old in my home, and we try not to have too many political discussions because, first of all, look at social media when it comes to politics. It's a sewer. It's tearing people apart. It's doing nothing productive whatsoever. But for me to get into an argument with my stepson, who, by the way, doesn't turn a TV on, doesn't turn a radio on, never picks up a newspaper. I know people think I'm a dinosaur that I still get one, but I do read it. Doesn't go to any of these websites. And by the way, because I need to be on top of everything, I consider myself to be a libertarian. This is one of the other things that I think is the problem of youth, and I got stuck in this even when I was your age and maybe a little bit younger. You're all about black and white. You're all about absolutes. There are no grays. You're just like, well, it's either this or it's this, and I don't want to hear anything else. I go to sites that are very left-wing in nature. I go to sites that are very right-wing in nature, and then I put it all together and I say, well, I choose to believe this, I choose to believe that, and that's where I come to my conclusion. To get into an argument with somebody who his only knowledge of politics is coming from social media and the conversations that he's having with other people his age who are just as clueless as he is and just as black and white is the most frustrating thing that I have ever run into in my entire life. So to hear you say off of that experience, you know what? I need to be more conscientious. I need to do more reading on all of this stuff is the breath of fresh air. That is the most welcome thing that I have seen come out of the mouth of somebody your age in a very long time. So hats off to you.
I have to admit, I can do better. Do I feel like I need to do more research? Absolutely. But I think the first step is admitting.
Well, you have to admit that you have a problem. That's the first step to anything.
Right, exactly. And what I found was a big sign as well was my stepfather really likes to give his opinion. Whether it's politics, whether it's what to eat for dinner, doesn't matter. Loves giving his opinion. And I find myself getting so mad at his political views that I just have to sit there because I know that I don't have facts to back up how I feel. Because I can't look at my dad in the face and go, well, Sally from Virginia said this on Facebook and I agree with her. He'll look at me and just laugh.
So your frustration comes less with him, even though you do have that, and more with yourself.
It comes from lack of knowledge. And you know what also just is so frustrating? I did put more effort into trying to learn about government and trying to follow representatives. And what I find is that there is no boundaries on the internet that will make sure that the article or whatever I'm researching is in the middle. You know, like you have to constantly figure out like, okay, who wrote this article? Why are they writing this article? Because so many people just put out slander pieces to confuse you.
Things are to an extreme to the extent, and I never thought that I would see this, that comedy shows, late night comedy, has become so sanctimonious and preachy. It's not about making you laugh anymore. It's about trying to influence how you think. And I think my biggest frustration is from people who get their news that way, from people who get their news from social media, and also to speak about what I am talking about with my generation versus yours. Never mind the fact that we tend to read a lot more and research a lot more. We also have life experience, which I think is not respected in some circles from your generation. Look, I was once a lot younger too, and my parents frustrated me and my grandparents, but then I would say to myself, well, you know, my grandparents did go through the Depression, and they did go through World War II, and the biggest problem that I have right now is the microwave's broken, or whatever it was when I was a little fat kid. And I just don't think, not only from an age perspective, but even in all of us perspective, look at social media. where is respect? I think there is a total absence of it because of what you're talking about. There's no middle ground on anything. It's all about extremes. It's all about having to be right versus getting things right.
Absolutely. It's so quick. I need to respond rather than I need to listen.
I need to win. You need to lose.
You know what?
That's what it is. And that's where safe spaces come from, and service animals, and people not being able to accept that sometimes things just don't go your way. And throwing a temper tantrum is not going to fix it. But what bothers me even more, and I guess I do like the fact that your generation can be complacent to this degree, but if it changes, this is going to bother me. Not only are you getting information, and not you specifically, Maddie, and again, you're saying a lot of the right things here, the wrong way and throwing it in my face, but the prospect of you being able to enter a voting booth without having that knowledge is terrifying. But
Right.
I do think a lot of people your age, just as much as they don't care about the research, don't care enough to go and vote.
Absolutely, 100%. The 2016 election made me realize I have to pay attention. I didn't vote. My first time voting, I was 24 because I was not going to go and vote at 18 years old because I knew I had no bleeping clue what I was talking about. But then 2016 happened, and we all know how that ended. And
Right.
watching it, how it ended, really upset me. And that's when I realized, like, oh crap. Was it my one vote that made it happen that way?
Well, let me say this. In the state that you live in, no, it wasn't your one vote, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't. And let me also, from this perspective, deliver this message. Look, if we disagree, different strokes for different folks, as long as you are well-read and doing your research. Opinions are what they are. There are certain areas of the left-wing agenda with which I agree. There are other areas of the right-wing agenda with which I agree. And I feel like I kind of am that middle, but I know a lot of other people who are on extremes. But again, if this is based off of the work and the education that you've done, fine. We can just agree to disagree.
Yeah.
But if you're a blowhard and you're not paying attention to anything, shut up.
Well, yeah, I mean, circling back, I think that there are benefits to controversies because it gets people talking. It gets people trying to look at a situation in different ways. I think good can come out of it if you're open-minded.
But here's what I think is the problem on that front. I do think you're right. I do think that controversies can serve as a wake-up call to people. But we live in this society that is so fast-paced with such a short attention span. Nothing has staying power and outrages people for long enough. You know, and I hate to bring this up and put it in this way, but you'll have all of these mass shootings all over the country.
I know.
And within a couple of days, we've moved on to the next thing.
You know
And
what?
Where is the outrage when it comes to stuff like that?
Oh, my gosh.
The lingering outrage.
The lingering outrage. That's exactly it. You know what I see in like probably the next 10 years, our presidential campaigns or whatever, when we vote, I feel like it's going to be an app where it's like swipe left, swipe right. I don't like him. Swipe left. Ooh, swipe right.
It's
like
a
that.
Tinder app for president. You know what? You want to move to Canada? Let's go.
Let's go. Let's get out of here.
Well, I don't know if we solve the world's problems. We set out to do that each and every week here on Bridging the Gap. But you have every right to weigh in just as much as we do. Maddie, there's all kinds of social media platforms that we have for that.
So many. Find us at Cat Country Mornings, YouTube, Facebook, Instagram. We are taking over the social media world. So make sure you look up Cat Country Mornings and join the conversation.
And until next time, I'm Brian.
I'm Maddie.
This is Bridging the Gap. We'll see you then.